Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the EDHRECast. We have another two-man show for you today. It's Ace and Base. It's Dana Roach over there with me.
I just got back from a once-in-a-lifetime holiday, but unfortunately I only have one lifetime, so I never get to do it again. But it was a great time, and I'm glad to be back.
Well, hopefully you get to do other good trips, just not those once-in-a-lifetime trips. Not that trip, no.
Yeah.
You got to have other trips.
I'll figure something out, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, everyone, Joey's not here this week, but that doesn't mean we don't have a great episode for you. And Dana, you and I have been talking about this a lot behind the scenes, and now I'm glad we finally have a chance to kind of talk about it with listeners, for the listeners out there. So what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about how deck building has never been harder and explain why that is.
Yeah, it really has. So I'm glad I finally have a chance to talk with you about it, because I agree with you. It really is hard. But real quick, before we get into that, we got a few quick plugs that we got to do before we get started.
We are excited to be members of Team Ultimate Guard. The fact that we used their products before we became partners with them made this a natural fit, and we have nothing but great things to say about everything they make. When I used to travel to events, the TSA would always stop me and inspect my deck boxes when I went through security. And since I started using Ultimate Guard's boulders, well, they still stop me, but my decks look really, really good stored in a boulder with katana sleeves. So now when I get searched, I'm getting searched in style. It's an excellent product, and we can't recommend them enough.
See, at least when I get searched, I'm using a lot of those clear boulders, so people look in there and immediately know what a nerd I am.
And know what it is? Sure, yeah.
Well, and if you would like to support the show, you can do so. There's a lot of ways to support the show. Easiest way, just leave a review on your podcast app. That means the world to us, and it helps actually more than you would think. So leaving a review, subscribing on YouTube, liking this video even, all great and free ways to support the show, and it's just a fantastic thing to do. And we appreciate all that support. But if you would like to, you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels, whether you want to join our Discord community, you want to see episodes a day early. There's all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the coveted weekly patron shoutout. So this week, very, very special thank you to Alexander Bullard, who did not the Dullard thing, but the Bullard thing. Went to EDHRECast's patron, signed up, and Alexander, thank you so much for the support.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Because of supporters like you, we can actually do this show week in and week out, and it really does mean a lot to us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get into it. So Dana, you said deck building has never been harder. I agree with you, but I really want to get into this because, man, it really is such a difficult thing to do. I don't think that making cuts to my decks has ever been an easy thing to begin with, but it's just gotten impossibly hard lately.
Yeah, and I think this is something that maybe people don't appreciate if they're relatively new to Commander. If you're a boomer like us in terms of like how long we've been playing, though, I think we need to explain what has changed. And the example here that really jumps out to me that I will use is when I first built my Sphinx Typal deck, and we're talking like 10 years ago now.
Yeah, you've had that deck for a while.
Yeah, I had to run Petra Sphinx, which is a real card that you've never heard of, listeners. It's a white Sphinx from Legends that doesn't even have flying. But like, if I wanted to have enough Sphinxes in that deck, I had to run Petra Sphinx. There was like, I think 17 legal bodies at the time, and that was one of them. So when like Theros came out and we got Metamai the Ageless, I'm going from this genuinely really bad, difficult to cast, non-flying Sphinx to one that gives me an extra turn when it hits, has evasion, has a much bigger body. That is a huge upgrade in that deck. And back then, almost every change you got, every time a new set came out, the cards that you were adding to your decks were pretty regularly replacing something maybe not as bad as Petra Sphinx, but like something not good.
Oh, yeah.
That is not how it works anymore. And I think, as Matt can attest, when you're looking at your lists every single time you want to make an upgrade, there's not Petra Sphinxes that are jumping out at you as an easy replacement.
Well, and yeah, you're absolutely right, where it's so hard because back when you and I first started playing Commander, we really didn't have options. And a good example, I think, of this that's fairly recent is you and I both have Eldrazi Scion decks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have Raga Draga, which is all about making my Eldrazi Scions and spawns big, whereas you're sacrificing all of them that you make to all sorts of just sack outlets that you have. But we just, for so long, we didn't really have any options as far as what are we going to play? Like, we had to play cards like Nest Invader, and that's not a good card by any means.
Right.
Or Scion Summoner. And with Modern Horizons 3, we have almost too many options now.
Yeah. I think I had like a dozen potential upgrades for that deck. I mean, that's more than 10% of my list I was looking at replacing.
Yeah.
And, you know, at least in those particular decks, because there's so many bad things that make spawns and scions, there were at least a few obvious cuts, but that's just very rarely the case. For the most part, when like you are getting a new card for a deck, it's replacing something almost equally as good. And that is really, really difficult to do.
It does feel like we're just getting so many cards that have just raised the floor for what a commander deck is expected to be able to do to kind of just participate in games. I don't know if that's a great direction, but it is kind of something that I think you and I have noticed. And just in general, I think the community is kind of seeing that a little bit too.
What I think is interesting about it, and I think we touched on this a few weeks back when we did the Modern Horizons 3 commons and uncommons, talking about things like MDFCs. Once upon a time, when they released something like an MDFC, maybe even the first wave of them, you know, Balagad Recovery, for example, being a really, really good MDFC, there wasn't a lot of reasons to not put that into a green deck. It was just really good. You probably had a, you know, pretty mediocre utility land you could pull, or a, you know, even a basic or something. We're at the point right now, though, where there's so many good utility lands that the thing you're taking out, you probably can't afford to pull a basic. It's probably such a lean count at this point. There's so many other good utility lands that it's a situation where, because you're taking good things out to replace this good thing, I think design has some leeway where they can print things that are more powerful because they're not replacing weak things, they're replacing equally powerful things. And I think that's kind of an interesting place to be, where like powerful cards replacing powerful cards doesn't change the power of your deck the way it once did when they were replacing mediocre cards.
Yeah, the saturation of just high-powered cards in any given deck, like that's absolutely a thing that I've noticed in my decks too, where I think a good example for me too that I've just been experiencing lately, well, not lately, but semi-recently, was Moonshaker Cavalry. When it first came out, you know, every deck, they only really had one copy of Craterhoof. And so Selesnya decks, like half of mine, getting a second copy of that, like it had to replace another powerful card. And I'm not playing a whole lot of tutors, but just that more, the instances that I'm seeing those types of overrun effects, having it double effectively has made such a huge impact in how often I'm just able to close out games significantly quicker because I'm not digging through my decks anymore. And that just means, yeah, the floor on all these decks is just so much higher now.
Now, to use that example, so let's take that thought experiment one step further.
Yeah.
So you're playing a Selesnya deck, and you've got the Moonshaker Cavalry, and you have a Craterhoof Behemoth, and that's pretty useful to have like two different ways to close out games with your creatures.
Yep.
But if they print, you know, Moonshaker Behemoth or Craterhoof Cavalry, and you have like two additional options, while those cards are really good, then you're at the point where you're like, okay, well, how many 8-drop creatures do I really want in my deck that I'm going to use for a finisher? Going from 1 to 2 is one thing. Going from 2 to 4 is another thing entirely. That just increases your odds of having like a spell you can't cast in your opening hand, or having redundant spells that don't really do anything. So that's the saturation point that I think that's interesting. The move from 1 to 2 is probably one that you would make in your deck. Does 2 to 4 is something you would do? I feel like probably not.
Well, and Joey and I had a really good conversation about that a couple weeks ago. So if folks want to hear more about how much is too much of just any given good thing, we had a really good conversation that I really enjoyed. But Dana, you and I, we had kind of been shifting more about, man, the competition for those card slots. Now, we're not talking how many you're putting in there, but just the quality of cards has gone up so much. And I think a really good example of this that we talk a lot about on the show is 2-mana rocks, 3-mana rocks, and just the artifact ramp, and just how it got so good for a while, but now it's staying equally as good. And now we're just there. These new cards are pushing out cards that kind of revolutionized that deck building space.
Yeah, Cursed Mirror, I think, is one of the first ones we really got excited about when that came out.
Oh yeah,
the 3-mana red rock that can come into play as a copy of a thing. Always super useful. And that was one of those things you're like, oh, I'm playing red, I can afford to have 1 3-mana ramp spell, you know, and the rest 2. That's not a big deal, and if it's really, really useful. Yeah. Except for now, there's so many really good 3-mana rocks that you went from. At least myself personally, I went from, oh, I'm probably going to run Cursed Mirror in every red deck, to, well, there's a couple other things that are equally as good that I might want to consider instead. So like that's no longer that's gotten pushed out because there's other options that might work a little bit better. I think that's a really interesting dynamic I think we've hit.
Yeah, Heraldic Banner, it's the same thing for me.
Yeah.
If you're playing a monocolor deck, it still is it's a very, very good card. But if you're playing a multicolor deck, I mean, Heraldic Banner, even if you're playing very heavily skewed to one color, it's still got competition in that 3 mana slot, where otherwise, when it was first printed in the first Eldraine set, it was absolutely powerful. Like, you were like, I can't believe how good this card is. Now it's kind of gotten pushed down a little bit. So I hate to say this, but Commander kind of has become a rotating format just with how powerful these cards have gotten, because everything, like you pointed out, like, cards aren't competing with these bad Scion Summoner quality cards anymore.
Right.
You're cutting very good cards that you're adding to decks, not just a year ago.
Yeah. I mean, and it's even true in the 2 mana slot. If we ignore the mana crypts and Mox Diamonds of the world and like just assume you're playing
fast mana, we don't need to talk about fast mana.
Yeah, but assuming you're playing on a budget, okay, you're probably going to put a Soul Ring in your deck, and then at the 2 mana rock slot, you're looking at the Felwar Stones, the various signets in your color pairing, the Talisman in your color pairing, Arcane Signet, Everflowing Chalice. Okay, well now we're up to like 6 2 mana rocks then.
Yeah.
And we haven't even gotten to like the Liquid Metal Torque, your Mind Stones. Mm-hmm. Something is going to come out. You're not going to run a dozen 2 mana rocks in addition to your Soul Ring. You're only going to run probably 8-ish, maybe 10 tops. Something has to come out. So therefore, WotC's in a position, number one, they can maybe release a couple more 2 mana rocks because it's going to not bump something out of your deck for sure. But then you will find yourself in this position where, like, when Arcane Signet came out, I didn't have to do a lot of thinking. I just put Arcane Signet in my deck and removed something that was worse. Well, now when the next one of those cards come out, I have to decide, okay, is this worth running? It only makes colorless mana, but do I want to risk knocking out Felwar Stone, for example? Or do I want to risk knocking out Everflowing Chalice, a card that, like, sometimes later on in the game, if I have nothing to do, I can drop it and turn it into a 4 mana rock or something. So it forces you to really make hard choices.
Yeah, and again, we can go back to the 3 mana slot where you've got stuff like Replicating Ring, you've got all sorts of just wild stuff that, like, they're great cards otherwise. And like, I think one nice reminder every now and then is when I get a chance to play Brawl. And I don't love Brawl right now, the state of it, especially after Modern Horizons, has just been cumbersome, to be generous with it. But it is still a nice reminder every now and then, like, oh yeah, that card actually is really good. And yeah, you're playing it in Brawl where maybe you don't have access to some of the more staple quality mana rocks in Commander, but reminding yourself, like, you have all these options. And so if you're doing a specific thing in any given deck, you want to give these another look because they're still powerful cards. They've just been crowded out by all these other options we're getting.
Well, and since we're talking about ramp, in the last year, we got Glimpse the Core, which was the first 2 mana go get a land spell in green we've gotten in a long time. And I went through and I put that in most of my green decks. But again, I think now we're at an equilibrium point there with green land ramp in the 2 mana slot, at least, where Glimpse the Core is there. You've got your Farseek, Nature's Lore. 3 Visits is now affordable. That wasn't affordable for a long time. Rampant Growth. And then again, you're probably running a Soul Ring. So now you're at the point where even in green, where you're not running the mana rocks, there's enough 2 mana ramp spells. That's before we even get into the Cultivates of the world or things like Wild Growth or whatever. We're at an equilibrium point there where if you're going to put something in, you're probably being forced to take something that's good out versus taking out Explosive Vegetation or something.
See, I don't know that green really needed any more help. Like, yes, it's been a while, and Glimpse the Core was the first 2 mana ramp that we've gotten in a while. I'm fine with that because green already did mana so much better for so long than other colors.
Right.
I think it's more the mana rocks that we're talking about was letting other colors catch up to what green had been doing the whole time. There was a while, several years ago, where you kind of had to play green if you really wanted to play at high-powered decks.
Sure.
Just because the resource accumulation that green gave you.
But even at this point, like, even if they did release 3 more variants of those, I don't know if it puts green ahead because I don't know if you want that many of those spells. I think then at that point, it turns into a situation where you're removing ones that already exist from your deck for one that fits your deck a little bit better.
Yeah.
And like, that's kind of the whole point of this, is this weird stasis point where Glimpse the Core was maybe one that I would add in addition to what I already had, but I'm at the point right now that put me to that point where the next time they do one, something is going to come out.
Yeah, and that's just, it's such a tight thing. I think another more recent version of this type of effect that we're really seeing in a lot of decks is just all the really, really good red impulse draw.
Yeah.
For a while, we kind of were like, well, it's getting rummage effects. We had stuff like Big Score, which is fine as far as just kind of being able to filter through all your cards in your hand. But man, then we got Ren's Resolve, we got Reckless Impulse, and now we just most recently got Glimpse the Impossible. So you have all these different versions of something that's just pushing so many other cards out. And like, you really don't need that many other versions of this type of effect because they're all super powerful, but also like, again, you're going to kind of get these diminishing returns by putting too many versions of that in your deck instead of, I have to pick the best 3.
Well, when Outpost Siege was spoiled, and again, 10-ish years ago, or closing into that anyway, I was like, Red's Phyrexian Arena. I'm putting that in every, mono red or Boros deck until the end of time.
Yeah.
But again, we've gotten so many options. Like, how many of those things do you want? Because they don't necessarily stack that well, how many cards do you want to have exiled with a time limit on how often you can use them? Mm-hmm. I mean, I run a few of those things, but like you don't want to have too many. And we're at the saturation point where I went from once upon a time going, Outpost Siege is going in every one of these decks to I don't have it in any of my red decks or Boros decks anymore because there's that many more options. I got something else that was a little bit better fit for my deck, and instead of adding it in alongside Outpost Siege, I took Outpost Siege out. It went from Outpost Siege being a huge power leap when I added that to those decks to kind of a side grade when I'm replacing it with something that might just be a little bit more fluid in that list.
Yeah, I also thought I was never going to take Outpost Siege out. And
yeah.
I think it's just how I've been conditioned over the past few years. I still instinctively will reach for Outpost Siege and start putting it into any deck playing red. Mm-hmm. But then I'm like, why would I want to only do one or the other when I can just play Brazen Cannonade and get both versions of Outpost? Yeah, it does everything.
Do both the things.
And so it's such a weird situation where like I just out of habit am grabbing these old cards that I don't really need to play because they're just not going to hold up. They're not going to make the first round of cuts anyways. Mm-hmm. So mentally, at least for me, I have to get over, okay, Outpost Siege, yeah, I'm going to do Big Score. I'm going to do any of these types of rummaging effects, even because, why? Because I can just play these and the floor is just so much higher now.
Yeah. I touched on utility lands here, but I guess we can talk about that in a little bit more detail. The one that jumps out at me was when Scavenger Grounds came out in Amonkhet. Mm-hmm. I love Scavenger Grounds. There's not a ton of downside to it. It doesn't come into play tapped. And it doesn't really hurt you. And there's enough situations where you see the graveyard player doing a thing and you're like, Joey, I'm going to exile all the graveyards, specifically Joey. So like I jammed that into every single one of my decks. It wasn't a difficult thing to do because I'm like, oh, well, I will pull out the Buried Ruin I was running in this deck in case an artifact went in their graveyard. And this one, this one had 12 basics and I'll pull out one of the basics and whatever. We just got a ton of MDFCs as well as some really good utility lands like Talon Gates of Madura, I think is what it is, in Modern Horizons 3.
Yep.
That once upon a time, I would have been in the same situation as Scavenger Grounds where, there was a ton of obvious things I could pull out. That's not where we're at. Like the decisions I was having to make if I wanted to run these lands that once upon a time, not that many years ago, would have been an auto include is not how it works now. I was looking, I'm like, I have to make a decision. Do I still want this Core Haven in this deck? Or do I still want, 3 different land removal lands or is Demolition Field coming out? Because this one list happens to have a Strip Mine and a Wasteland or something. I'm making choices in a way that I didn't have to actually think about these things not that many years ago.
Well, and Dana, you're not even taking to mind either the fact that Scavenger Grounds, you need to sacrifice deserts to activate it and nuke the graveyards. Well, we got a whole bunch more deserts that aren't terrible anymore.
Right.
Because for a while there, when we first had Amonkhet, the only deserts we had weren't very good. Mm-hmm. And now that we've gone back to had the Outlaws at Thunder Junction, we have a ton more deserts now that actually can fit the bill as far as, okay, I have to kind of be real careful with my mana base, but I can fit 2 deserts in plus scavenger grounds. So you're going to get multiple activations of that scavenger grounds.
Well, we've talked about how all these lands have made the original Ravnica bounce lands so much better because you can bounce MDFTs or you can bounce back the channel lands or whatever and reuse them, which I think is a really good point, and I like those a lot. Except for if you want to put one of those bounce lands in your deck, you have to pull something like a really good dual land out.
Yeah.
And there's so many good dual lands. I feel like every year, at least once, if not twice, we get either a cycle being finished or a whole new cycle of really genuinely good 2-color lands, or if not 3-color lands sometimes. Whereas years ago, you're like, well, Guildgate, that's good enough for this deck. Unless you're playing a Gate, there's no reason unless you're playing a Gates deck to throw a Guildgate in the list like there was 6, 8, 10 years ago.
I do miss the days when Guildgates were a fine. I guess we can play it, and they're still fine. If you're playing on an ultra budget, and I mean, absolutely, it's all subjective. So, but I do agree, and I'm glad that we've kind of slowed down with getting new versions of that. And WotC's kind of leaned into, we're just going to reprint a really good cycle of dual lands instead of giving another option, just because at least my mana base is safe from being crowded out. Now I know the utility lands keep getting better and better, and you don't run any basics anyways.
Right.
But it's there's still a little bit of reassurance that, okay, they're at least going to make sure that these really good dual land cycles are just made more accessible because there's so many copies running around. They're staying cheap too. That's one thing I do appreciate, because it does alleviate from us having to find room for another cycle of rare lands.
Yeah, I think the last time we really had a challenging dual land situation, I guess it really wasn't that long ago, was the Surveil lands. That was the last one where
I guess that's true. Yeah, you're making me look silly 30 seconds later. Yeah,
but I agonize over those. Looking at that, I'm like, oh, what do I?
And they're so good. They're so good.
They're so good. But every land you're pulling out, for the most part, that you were pulling out to make room for those Surveil lands was also a good land.
The amount of play that the Surveil lands have added just as a layer to what I'm doing, I severely underrate it, because so often, if people are playing fetch lands in their mana base, they're playing shocks, they're playing the Surveil lands. So many times people are just habitually still fetching to grab a shock land, have it come into play tapped. Well, why would you do that? Because why don't you just grab a Surveil land? You're letting it come into play tapped anyways, so just get that Surveil, control the next top deck. And I am watching the Pro Tour that just happened. We just had Pro Tour Modern Horizons 3, which was a bird fest. There were more birds than Thanksgiving with all the Nadus running around.
It was like an Alfred Hitchcock movie over there in the Netherlands.
Oh, absolutely. Alfred Hitchcock would have loved it. But still, the point of people were fetching and they're playing all these Surveil lands in all these modern decks where it used to be, it's all about speed, and now it's all about, I have to hit the right cards at the right moment.
Yep.
And so end of turn fetching to grab Surveil lands was so wild to me, just seeing the high level of play that I think a lot of players kind of slept on. Well, I have to have all my lands untapped. But it's a case of, well, you have both. You don't have to cut out everything.
Yeah.
Because again, you're cutting basics for these Surveil lands. You're cutting the next weakest cycle. There's so many lands that I love. You and I have disagreed on the thriving lands, for example, in 3-4 color decks, 5-color decks, because you get to pick the colors. I don't even think those are even making the cut in my decks anymore. And I used to love those.
There was a lot of years I was really wanted them to finish the Odyssey filter cycle of lands, and they finally did in the last year. I'm like, well, it's too late. There's so many other good things. I don't want to run them now. They've been replaced by all the other good dual lands they've released. Where were you 5-6 years ago?
Yeah, it's such a nice thing. At least we have options, and it's never a bad thing to have options. But man, I feel like the options, they're just so close, and you're just picking percentage points when it comes down to, okay, do I want this or this? And the nice, at least side effects so far is, no matter what you're doing, you have a lot of options, no matter what you're doing in the deck, no matter what direction, no matter what theme, style, creature type, whatever, you have a ton of options.
Well, speaking of options, why don't we look at a few options for cards that could be challenged and challenge the stats?
Let's do it. Let's get into that. So a lot of data out there on EDHREC. We don't always agree with it, so let's take a quick moment to challenge the stats.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Social media is an absolute nightmare made entirely of dumpster fires. I have to use it as part of my job, but for a lot of years, I used to use it in very unhealthy ways. I would start fights over things that absolutely did not need to be fought over, or worse, find myself comparing myself to other people in unnecessary ways. Comparison is a thief of joy, and it's really easy to envy other people's lives. People may make it look like they have it all together on their Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't, and it's really easy to get caught up in that comparison. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and dealing with things that upset you or make you angry, and just figuring out how to set boundaries. All in all, it just empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It's not just for those who've experienced major trauma, it's for all kinds of people looking for self-actualization. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online and it's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/EDH today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/EDH. So my first challenge this week is for a card from way back in the day. This is like 9 or 10 sets ago. Murders at Karlov Manor. And I say that as a joke, but like at this point, I'm probably not very far off. That was close to 8 or 9 sets ago at this point. Connecting the Dots is an enchantment, 1 in a red. Whenever a creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library face down, and then you can spend 1 in a red to discard your hand and sacrifice Connecting the Dots and put all cards exiled with it into their owner's hands. So it's a 4 mana for kind of a one-sided wheel. This is only in about 2,600 decks right now, just total. And I'm running it in one list, and I actually saw it in 2 different games in the last week where someone else was playing it in addition to myself. And I don't think I saw this go make a move for less than 12 cards into someone's hand. And one time I think it was 20 in a Krenko deck. This isn't something you want to run probably in every deck, but if you are playing red and you have any kind of go wide strategy, very often this can wind up being just 4 mana to pitch your hand and draw a dozen cards, if not more. Like I said, it doesn't go everywhere, but I do think this card is just generally being slept on, probably in part because this wasn't a super popular set. Murders at Karlov Manor is one of the least selling sets, at least in the last couple of years. It's just easy to miss stuff in general. I think this card just got missed. In the right deck, it is absolutely disgusting and should see more play than just 2,600 decks right now.
Yeah, that's a super good cut, Dana. So I have a challenge this week. And actually, so Ryan Allen sent us an email, which you can do, EDHRECast@gmail.com, and had a really good point. It's not so much a challenge necessarily as side effects of putting in some new cards. And it's absolutely just a solid point. So Ryan said a little less popular commander, but one of my favorites, Heliod the Radiant Dawn, which is the Azorius blue-white version of Heliod. It has cards like Rise of the Eldrazi and Kozilek the Great Distortion showing up in 13% of decks respectively. I can see how players think that this might work in a deck that makes spells cheaper, but because of the colorless pips, most decks will not be able to cast these cards very consistently at all. And when you look into the deck, it's absolutely true. So the big ability that we're keying in on with Heliod is the backside, which is the Phyrexian God Heliod, where spells you cast cost 1 generic mana less for each card your opponents have drawn this turn. So the deck kind of does some group hug type of things, which forces players to draw cards and uses those as a cost reduction on big and powerful spells. So you're playing stuff like Prosperity, where each player draws X cards to power up oftentimes Eldrazi. And cards like Rise of the Eldrazi, they're very, very powerful. It's 9 and then 3 colorless mana. So 3 colorless pips right there. For sorcery, it says the spell can't be countered, and then you destroy target permanent. Target player draws 4 cards, take an additional turn after this one, and then you exile Rise of the Eldrazi. This is a super powerful card, absolutely. But when you look at the average deck, it's playing 2 lands that produce colorless mana, which means you have to have one of those out, plus your Soul Ring or any colorless mana ramp that you're playing, just to be able to cast it at all. So the mana reduction is fantastic. You playing 3 mana for this is great, but you have to have the right mana. And I've had this observation when I was updating my Raga Draga deck, for example. I have so many colorless pips in the mana cost of my spells now, I have to treat this as a 3-color deck. And so same thing with cards like Rise of the Eldrazi, like Kozilek the Great Distortion. You kind of have to treat those like a third color when you're putting them into your decks. So this is a very, very good catch, Ryan. Thank you for sending the email first off, but also thank you for just reminding us of another valuable lesson that, yeah, if you're adding these colorless pips, you have to take a look at your mana base and make sure you can even cast these spells, because sometimes you just can't.
Yeah, especially I think for newer players, it's not very obvious the difference between generic mana and colorless mana.
Yep.
Because once upon a time that really wasn't a thing, but like those are distinctly different things, and it's not always very intuitive on the cards that there is a difference in those. So yeah, that's a very easy thing to get caught up in if you're not prepped for it. And I think that's the best way to phrase is what you said, Matt. Think of it as a 3-color deck if you're running many of these effects for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks again, Ryan, for the email. Thanks for the challenge. And Dana, let's get back into it. So one thing you had kind of touched on a little bit was the lands. I want to take this a step further, and we've talked a lot about different categories, and one that especially is getting dense, and I know one of my favorite cards from Modern Horizons 3 is a protection spell, but that category in itself has also gotten incredibly dense, and you're cutting Tamiyo Safekeeping maybe, and I know that sounds sacrilege to you.
Yeah, that was so. Heroic Intervention is the first kind of one of these that I felt like, oh, this is probably going in every green deck. And then when we got Tamiyo Safekeeping, like, well, it only saves one thing, but like saves any one thing that's a single green mana, and that's really often worth running as well. But then we got Smuggler's Surprise, that does the protection thing and more. We got Collective Resistance that will save a thing and destroy some things. So now, again, you're at the making choices point. I would have, there was a window there where if I was brewing a green deck, I was probably putting Tamiyo Safekeeping in it, like just by default, along with Heroic Intervention.
Yeah.
And now that there's this many options, I don't want 4 of them, let alone all the other Rapid Vigor-esque cards that we've gotten years ago. I don't want that many, so I am no longer adding good things to my decks. I am taking something good out to put one of these things in.
And I put Tyvar's Stand into a deck, and I think it maybe lasted a set before I took it out.
Right.
And Tyvar's Stand is super good too, especially if you're playing a combat-focused style of deck where, because Tyvar's Stand, you can give target creature +X until end of turn, in addition to just casting it for 1 mana to give it the hexproof indestructible till end of turn. So there's powerful cards that I really wanted to like Tyvar's Stand so much more. But then we're seeing cards like Revitalizing Repost, new cards that are just like, okay, this is doing it, but either it's going to be more powerful, it's easier to cost, more flexible. Like you get all this modality from these MDFCs, and I hate to rag on them because they're great, but also stop making me make these difficult decisions. I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, and really, like, white is in the same boat as well. With Teferi's Protection kind of being the equivalent of Heroic Intervention in white, and then we got Blacksmith Skill, which is a little bit of the equivalent of Tamiyo Safekeeping. But then we got Clever Concealment, and then we got Galadriel's Dismissal. Mm-hmm. And like, how many of those things do you want? And for years, you already had like the Ghost Way kind of cards as well. If you want to blink your stuff out to save it or get ETBs again, you're making choices. Blacksmith Skill was a card that for a little window there, I was probably running in most of my white decks. And I've had to like make choices. Galadriel's Dismissal is super good. Clever Concealment is super good. I'm not running all of them. So like good cards are being replaced by good cards, and it winds up being like, instead of this big upgrade where you're turning a mediocre card into something great, you're turning a great card into a different great card that might just work a little bit better with your play style or your deck or whatever.
Yeah, or that's easier to cast or anything like that. Like, yeah. And I think it's wild to me now. But like saying Teferi's Protection, everybody knows how powerful of a card that is. Mm-hmm. I think if it was released in 2024 and maybe we had Clever Concealment first, I think people would be like, oh, wow, that's really good. But I don't think they would have been blown away quite the same way that it would have been like when it was released. Just, I would say 3 years ahead of its time, maybe. Yeah,
because at the time it was something that like I felt like there was nothing else close to that in white.
There's nothing competing with what Teferi's Protection was doing when it was first printed.
Yeah.
There's a lot competing with Teferi's Protection these days. Yeah. And I think that's kind of the perfect example of what we're trying to express this whole episode.
Yeah. just the density of like really good, really playable cards that do the thing you want has just changed so much in the last few years for sure.
Yeah.
The other one, like we talked about this when it got removed, when it got previewed for removal, Stroke of Midnight.
Yeah. Yeah.
When Generous Gift came out, the color shifted version of Beast Within, I'm like, oh, that's going in, all my white decks. It's a great piece of removal. Stroke of Midnight, I'm like, do I want 2 of those? Because I already have probably maybe Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile on the deck as well. All right, maybe there's room for this, but I've got other things I like too. White's got so much good removal. Well, now if we got a third version of that 3 mana remove a thing, leave a token behind. Okay, well, do I want 3? Probably not, and something else has to come out. So they could conceivably release a different variant on that every set, and it's not going to probably change my deck's makeup too much because I'm at the point where I'm running as many of those as I probably want to run, and all it would do is replace one of the previous ones maybe.
Yeah, and it's not to say we don't want to play all these cards, but unfortunately, the rules committee decided we have to have 100 cards in our deck, so we can't play all these. We don't want a 130 card deck. I don't want a 130 card deck anyways. The rules committee knows what they're doing.
Yes,
I don't mean to make that a shot at the rules committee, but it's just so hard because you want to play all these. Like I know I'm gonna want to cast them eventually, and you're gonna have these thoughts of like, okay, well, if I would have just been playing the 5th protection spell or the 5th removal spell, I would have had an opportunity to kill that thing. But I mean, Stroke of Midnight is such a good example because we have cards, I think, at this point, honestly, that are competing with Path to Exile. Yeah. Yes, Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, they're the gold standards, but we've gotten some pretty gold cards lately, and it's just, you're getting more flexibility, maybe a little bit of tweaks on how it's executed, but the single target removal is just so good. And the board wipes, Dana. The board wipes they're so good, and you have so much flexibility. You have so much upside that you can get when you're casting these now, and that just wasn't the case. You had, I guess I'll play Day of Judgment because I just need another board wipe, and you don't have to play Day of Judgment anymore.
Right. Yeah. I ran Day of Judgment in decks. It was legitimately a pretty good. I mean, it was efficient. It was number one, like cheaper to buy than Wrath of God, which for a while there was $6-8. So like it was a budget version of that. There was reasons to run Day of Judgment. I can't think of the last time I've seen it or even considered it for a deck. I
mean, I was reminded that it exists when they announced Magic Foundations, I believe is the name of the set.
I thought the same thing. I'm like, I have not thought of that card in a long time. It's good to see it still in existence.
I'm sure I have a few of them in a box somewhere that I just haven't gotten rid of at this point. But I know that people love to say like, never sell your cards because whatever, they're going to spike. I think it's pretty safe to say this one, isn't ever going to spike up in value, but also I don't know if you're ever going to cast it again. You just have so many better options, especially if you're in ultra lean mode and you have to be the most mana efficient possible, and Wrath of God just isn't cutting it for you anymore, I guess, but also just play a 5 mana Wrath and get yourself some upside.
Yeah. I mean, don't play Farewell, obviously.
Well, that's taken it too far. I'm not a monster.
Right. But yeah, no, there's just white. And again, it's a stasis point. They can release another great board wipe as long as it's not as good as Farewell and it's competing with something. Something has to come out. One of my favorite ones, Cleansing Nova, which was in the first Back to Ravnica set, 4 or 5 years ago or so, which was kind of like very similar to Austere Command. I assumed, I'm probably going to run Cleansing Nova in a ton of decks moving forward. And I
thought the exact same thing.
Yeah, and it made it a year or so, but like, again, so they just kept releasing really good white wraths. And now when I look at my white decks, actually, most of them are running different ones. I'm running ones that work well with that particular deck. It's no longer this one thing is always the best in slot for white removal. I guess maybe that is Farewell now for the most part, but like outside of that, you're customizing it based on like which one works best and based on your meta, your playstyle, your deck, whatever. And that's a better place to be than it is when you're just running, every deck is running the same obvious option.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I remember for a while there, I thought End Hostilities, especially in my playgroup specifically, that card was never going anywhere because we had a good amount of people who were playing some Voltron decks. They were playing any sort of type of equipment. And like, that's still a pretty well supported archetype, but even then, I thought End Hostilities, when it first came out in Cons of Tarkir, I thought that was never getting taken out of any deck ever. But then again, it kind of like Cleansing Nova, it kind of made it like 6 months, maybe a year. And then I'm like, oh, there's just better things.
For me, the one for me recently was Vanquish the Horde from Midnight Hunt.
Yep.
That's basically like White's version of Blasphemous Act, but probably better for the most part because it's not dealing damage, so it gets around a crazy big creature or something with protection from a color or whatever. Again, I thought, I'm probably gonna put that in every deck. It winds up being a 2-mana Wrath really frequently. And it's not. Like it's like some situations I would run it, but I'm picking and choosing which one works best. And it's a good place to be, but it also like it makes choices and makes cuts really, really challenging.
Yeah, and you and Joey like to make fun of me because I don't update my decks very often, which I did with Modern Horizons a little bit. But I mean, this is one of the reasons why, because just cutting out cards is such a hard thing to do. The process is like, it's painstakingly difficult sometimes, and that's just me like only half paying attention.
Right.
If I were as into it as you and Joey are, because you take it very seriously with how you update your decks. I can't imagine how much time I hope you guys get paid for at least the time you spend, because I don't need another unpaid internship.
Well, I just got back from a 2-week trip. Modern Horizons 3 quit being previewed just before I left, so I didn't get a chance to like order any cards for it. Mm-hmm. While I was gone, Assassin's Creed was entirely spoiled, and just as I get back, we start getting Bloomburrow stuff starting up. So I'm like, I took 2 weeks off, and I'm 2 sets behind.
And this is you popping back, and I am never going to financially recover from this trip.
Absolutely, yeah.
Not for the obvious reasons, not because you had the adventure of a lifetime, but because you just missed so many things going on.
Yeah, it's insane. And talking about removal and stuff here, I remember when Utter End was first previewed. Mm-hmm. Like, it's it's 1 more mana than Vindicate, but it's instant speed and it's an exile effect, and how great is that going to be? Like, we just got a better Utter End in Obtruse Appropriation.
Yeah,
and I don't know if I ever heard anybody even acknowledge that card existed.
Which is wild to me. Like, I thought Utter End was going to be a fantastic card. Like,
forever.
We now have a literal zero reason to ever run Utter End again, and that card was praised for being so flexible. It hits dang near anything, and now we just have we don't get to say this very often, but it is a strictly better version. Yeah.
When I was first playing Vindicate, I want to say was close to a $20 card.
I remember that
in an Orzhov deck, and I'm like, I don't want to spend that much for this removal spell. It's so good, and like now Vindicate is like the 9th best option among black-white removal spells.
Yeah, it truly is. I think it was indicated that the trend for Vindicate is not very good, because these cards are getting so good, and getting a strictly better version of a card doesn't happen very often, but that doesn't mean we get better versions or just cards that are going to get the same goal done, but just more flexible. And it has been fun to kind of shift the other way. So we've gotten all these hyper efficient or easy to cast versions of cards. But Dana, one thing that I know that we were talking about with our patrons is a chance to swing the other way. And we're getting away from the hyper efficiency as a way to counteract this, where instead we're playing cards that maybe cost a little bit more, but have more upside to that. And it's kind of another side effect of, we have all these options as far as efficiency goes and how powerful they are, but now we have options to get cards that are going to do the thing, plus get us bonus that slots in specifically to the deck strategy that we're doing.
Yeah, in kind of, we talked about it a little bit. The 3-mana rock was kind of the first thing that I looked at as like a luxury version of that, right? Like, I'm running a bunch of 2-mana rocks, but I can afford to run this one 3-mana rock as like this luxury version of it. And we've always had that a little bit with say counter spells, where you would have something that like make a bunch of treasure or something when you counter a spell, and it's going to cost you 5 mana to do so. But that's a decent trade-off if you want to do it.
I do love Spell Swindle. You are right. Absolutely. I love that card.
I've always liked Overwhelming Intellect. Same thing, like counter a creature spell to draw cards.
Yeah.
But you don't, again, how many, like we talked about with Crater Hoof, how many 8-drop creature overrun effects do you want? How many big, so like, if you're going to add the newest one of these expensive counter spells with a big upside, if you what are you going to take out if you want to add in the new one?
Yeah.
Because you don't want all your counter magic to cost 5 or 6 mana either.
Well, and I'm really struggling. I hope I never have to take out Astarion's Thirst. That was kind of the card that kind of kickstarted this trend for me personally in my deck building, where it's removal, it's +1/+1 counters, it's making creatures big. It does a lot of really cool things, but then there's cards like Pest Infestation that I absolutely love. And that even gets really expensive to really rely on steadily because, again, you don't want all your removal, all your artifact removal, all your disenchant type of effects to cost you 7 mana because you can't do that every turn.
Right. Yeah. For me, the one that jumps out at me a little bit is green. Green's big draw. And, Rishkar's Expertise. Again, it's one of those cards where I'm going to run Rishkar's Expertise forever in every single one of my decks. It's an excellent card.
I also thought the same thing.
Yeah. And I still haven't a lot of them, but then it's fighting with... We have Surveil Stampede. Oh, that's really good too. It's not really a draw, but it's doing that kind of effect. Okay, that's excellent. I can maybe run both of those. Kindred Summons, though, is really expensive, but it's really good in some decks too. Oh, Last March of the Ents is super.
Return of the Wild Speaker, same thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah. How many 5 to 8 mana draw spells do I, or the equivalent thereof in green do I want? Mm-hmm. I don't want that many of them. And I think that lets them, Last March of the Ents is a super powerful card. But you can print those kind of cards now because if you're going to add it to your deck, you are forced to take out a Surveil Stampede or a Kindred Summons to make room for it.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And I mean, for me, Rishkar's Expertise, Last March of the Ents, flavor-wise and just what they did for me just in my deck building adventures, I'm never taking those out. Those are going to be the forevers. It's only if I want more copies of that type of effect that I'll add in Surveil Stampede, Return of the Wild Speaker, stuff like that. But that's me personally. But for players who don't have the emotional attachment to those cards, it is difficult because you don't want everything because eventually you need creatures in your deck that you're cheating out. You need creatures in your hand that you're going to put on the battlefield. You need creatures on the battlefield to draw the cards with Return of the Wild Speaker. So you can't have all these different versions and they're all competing against each other. And really it just comes down to, am I valuing the flexibility of a Return to the Wild Speaker, having the opportunity to draw a bunch of cards for the biggest creatures that I have, or do I want that overrun effect? Do I want knowing that Last March of the Ents, no matter what, is going to resolve unless you're me and people play Narset's Reversal against you? But still, do you want that sure thing? Do you want the upside, the flexibility there? You have to weigh out so many different factors because, again, you're taking out another powerful effect that you need in these decks.
Yeah, and you're also dealing with diminishing returns. Mm-hmm. As someone who had an Enchantress deck years ago, and I no longer have it together, but when Eidolon of Blossoms came out.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. I went from having, I think it was 3 or 4 Enchantress effects in that deck. Adding one more was a huge difference, that leap from 4 to 5. When we're at 10 or 11 now, getting a 12th is way less impactful than adding that 4th or 5th. And maybe the way the deck plays, maybe you do want to add that 12th one, but you are going to feel that way less than you felt getting that 4th one or getting that 5th one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The novelty maybe isn't there. And now you're just blown away with, well, this is doing the same thing, but just in some instances it's better, and finding out what that better is and what it needs to do to be better. That's what kind of the process that we're kind of keeping in mind when we're making these changes to our own decks, because every deck is different. Your Rishkar deck is going to want something different than mine. And so I want Return of the Wild Speaker because I'm going wider than you are, where you're going big and you just want 3 big things. Right. And so you're picking different ways to execute these things. It's such a difficult thing, and hopefully listeners are kind of understanding why we're saying it's never been more difficult to do this.
Yeah, the amount of time, it was just physically in terms of time. It was so easy when a card got spoiled years ago to know, I can finally take this piece of junk out of my deck that I was only running because I had no options. Versus now where I just started a list and I'm every one of these cards I could potentially take out is great, and I don't know what the right choice is. And I'm genuinely curious how listeners who do a lot of upgrades deal with that, because I don't have a solution.
at this point, I think what my grandma used to say is God don't make no junk. That applies to like everything they've been printing with Magic.
Nowadays, for sure, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the past few years has just been heater after heater.
Yeah.
So it's such a just dense field. So if there's one tip that you would say, Dana, as a kind of encouragement to wrap today up, what would you say to our listeners then as a piece of advice, something that's helped you navigate this field?
So one thing I kind of, and I'm not like doing this formally by taking notes, but like in my brain, one thing I've started keeping track of is when I'm playing a deck, there's a card in my hand. How often do I think to myself, this isn't what I need right now? And just make a mental note like, I don't want to cast this card in this game right now because while in theory it's going to be really effective, in practice, it's not that useful right now. And I make a mental note of that. And then I come back, like when it's time to make cuts, I look at it and go, what cards in this deck are ones that I got hung up on and like it didn't really fit the way I thought it would? Or at least a couple times. Maybe it works great once in a while, but like I just make a mental note of that, even kind of ahead of time. Like make almost like a mental watch list. I'm watching this card and that card because they didn't work quite the way I wanted, versus because you have to, versus like something just being an obvious removal. Yeah,
that's super good to keep in mind. Just keep being. They say like practice active listening, where you're listening, sure, yeah. You're affirming people. Practice active deck building and active playing, where you're keeping things in mind. You're looking critically at your own stuff while you're playing the deck. I love that. That's such a good thing to keep. And maybe don't like keep like murder boards and flow charts and Excel sheets like you do.
Right.
But I do think like mental notes and like, I drew this card. I wasn't really excited to see it. Set it aside. Maybe like turn it like backwards when you put your deck away. So you remember to look at that deck again and look at that card specifically.
Yeah. How about yourself? Is there anything like you are trying to do to make this process a little bit easier?
My biggest piece of advice is get good at using Scryfall. Yeah. I know that we're EDHREC here, and EDHREC is a fantastic tool. We use it a lot.
Yeah.
I think at this point in my deck building journey, I use Scryfall more than anything because it is such a powerful, just incredibly useful tool, and only gets better the better that you are at using it. So it rewards you for practicing a little bit and finding these hidden gems, learning what types of search terms that you want to practice, getting different parameters in place, anything like that. It's so powerful. It helps me find exactly what I want. And EDHREC is great for finding ideas and kind of getting that brainstorm going to kind of see what other people are doing. Advanced filters we talk about all the time here, but truly, like, I've found more like gem type of cards for my decks because I've practiced with Scryfall and I know how to get the results I'm looking for.
Usually at the end of a lot of these shows, we do ask for listener feedback because we want to hear what you have to say. And we mean that. However, I really want listener feedback in this one.
Yes.
Because I need help. Like any suggestions on like what y'all do to make it easier to make cuts, given the amount of cards and the amount of good cards that we have coming out just in a nonstop deluge, would be very useful. So genuinely, I would like to know what everyone is doing to find ways to make cuts in their deck, because it's really, really hard anymore.
I have 18 decks and I don't want to keep up with 18 decks. And so if there's a way to autopilot that a little bit, I want to hear from listeners. So please help me manage my decks. I don't even have that many decks, I feel, compared to some of our listeners.
Yeah.
So absolutely let us know in the comments, because genuinely we need some help. So help us navigate this field that is updating our decks.
Help us help you.
Absolutely. Well, let's wrap up real quick then. So Dana, where can everybody find you on social media?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I am writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Matt Morgan. You can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. So head over there to check out some of the best deck accessories, whether you need sleeves, deck boxes, carrying cases, all that and more. And you can find Joey on Instagram, Twitter, any of those social medias as well, at Joseph M. Schultz. And don't forget, you can send us an email at edhrecast@gmail.com. But that will do it for this week. So thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Dana, thanks for hanging in there with me today. And everyone, we will see you next week. So remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.